When you hear a game described as a first-person platformer, what immediately comes to your mind? Many people may think of an immersive parkour game like Mirror's Edge, the classic speed game Refunked, or some more modern indie releases inspired by movement shooters like Cyberhook. But when I think of first-person platforming, my mind always turns to the custom movement game modes built on Valve's seminal multiplayer lineup. The Counter-Strike series can be seen as the origins of the most popular custom modes like Surf, but of all these community-built game modes, there's one that has captivated me by far the most, and that's jump maps for Team Fortress 2. I was a big TF2 player when I was in middle school and early high school, and while I don't play the traditional multiplayer modes for the game anymore due to a lack of friends to play with, I do enjoy booting up the game every once in a while to play some jump maps. These types of maps are built around the soldier's rocket launcher, utilizing an engine quirk dating back to the Source engine's roots in the Quake engine, where explosions apply a physical force to the player capable of sending you flying at high speeds, which has been named rocket jumping. Jump maps are single-player obstacle courses built to be traversed using this technique, and in the over 15 years TF2 has been out for, there's been an enormous amount of depth to these maps that's been excavated by high-level players. Before I even started my channel, I had taken an interest in the design of rocket jumping in general, but particularly in TF2 since I have by far the most experience with that game. I wrote a whole essay on the design of the Market Gardener in TF2 as a warm-up to writing scripts for my videos, but aside from how the PvP modes incorporate and balance rocket jumping, the design of jump maps are just as intriguing to me, because despite these maps being a truly unique experience that hasn't been replicated elsewhere, they're also quite flawed in many places. Many advanced techniques have brutal precision windows, the soldier moves at a sluggish pace without the use of his rocket launcher, and the limitation of building maps for a game designed solely for PvP shows in the constant resupply sound effects and a lack of quick and simple tools for fast resets. Over the years of imagining my own dream games, this has been a big one ever since I started to put time into learning TF2 rocket jumping, a standalone game built from the ground up for single-player rocket jumping gameplay. There have been a few games that have tried something like this before, but they always seem to oversimplify the mechanics seen in TF2, either by being reduced to a 2D platformer, or by simplifying how explosions interact with the player down from the near infinite possibilities of precise angles and velocities. While these other games are enjoyable in their own right, there's still a game that I've always felt was notably absent from the world, and it's this absence I hope to remedy. So I guess this counts as an announcement for a game I've started to develop. My own standalone first-person platformer built around rocket jumping. Before getting into what I've already designed, I have to give some quick notes. Firstly, you may know me as someone who likes to get deep into narratives in games, which may seem at odds with this video you're watching right now. It's true that most ideas for games that I have are not something that I would be comfortable making a devlog series on, since they would contain even just minor spoilers for games that would be best played blind in order to get the most out of the story. But for this particular concept, I have absolutely zero plans for any potential story, and I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to try out this open development style, since physically playing the game itself is easily the biggest selling point of this game in particular, and spoilers would only minimally detract from the experience. Another important note here is that, similar to these videos I make, I'm doing this all in my free time with essentially zero funding. There are no guarantees that this game will release in any timely fashion, or at all. At the moment, I have a good amount of motivation to work on it, but that motivation can easily turn, as I've experienced with many projects before this. A related note is that the gameplay of the current prototype I'll show later in this video is covered in placeholder assets that will not reflect the look of the final product, if there ever ends up being a final product. Additionally, while I'm quite happy with the feel of the movement I have thus far, everything about what I'm going to show of this prototype is absolutely subject to change over development. But before I show any of that gameplay, I'd like to go over my design principles going into this project. There are 3 words I would use to describe these, which are as follows: standardization, approachability, and consistency. All 3 may seem to go hand in hand, but I'll go over each one to explain the distinctions I draw and how I expect them to be improvements over how jump maps work in TF2. Standardization is the one I expect will come the easiest, since it's simply what should occur by making a standalone game built specifically for this type of gameplay. While in TF2 you would need to go out of your way to find game servers or repositories of community creations in order to play jump maps, a standalone game carries the benefit of setting more concrete standards for levels and a much more streamlined new player experience. Sets of official levels can be created that ease new players into the mechanics, rather than requiring research or trial and error to figure out which maps are and aren't beginner-friendly. Approachability is fairly self-explanatory, though it's going to be the toughest challenge in level design for this game. Learning to rocket jump in TF2 is hard enough, considering the quick mouse movements required, without even getting into the advanced techniques like pogos, sinks, and beyond. With a standalone game like this, tutorials can be built into the game in order to construct a smooth difficulty curve that can't exist in a world of community-made maps. Making the satisfying experience of rocket jumping more accessible while still maintaining the depth that has grown to characterize its near-limitless skill ceiling will be a difficult design challenge, but I'm excited to tackle it. Consistency is the last word I mentioned, though it's the design problem I'll have to tackle first. If standardization is a problem of providing a seamless introduction to rocket jumping, and accessibility is a problem of designing a smooth difficulty curve using level design, then consistency is a problem of the underlying movement mechanics themselves. To illustrate this, there's an engine quirk in TF2 that allows you to get more height out of your rocket jumps called a C-tap, named for the way you tap crouch before shooting your rocket, rather than making all three inputs at once. The extra distance is enough that there are some jumps used in competitive play on certain maps that are only possible using this technique. It wouldn't be so much of a problem if it wasn't so frustratingly precise, with timing totally obfuscated from the player, which makes maps that require its use much less enjoyable to throw myself at than any other. Easing up on the precision of various precise techniques should help to make getting into rocket jumping a much more enjoyable experience that should lead to more people enjoying the journey of improvement when getting into the more brutally difficult challenges. So now, with all that background out of the way, here's footage of the prototype I have for the game currently. For what little time I've spent on this prototype, I've focused in on refining the underlying player movement physics before getting into implementing the rocket launcher and rocket jumping, all while keeping that consistency principle in mind. Though I did have to make some compromises, and to get into those compromises, I need to talk about movement in the source engine. The basic first-person control scheme is almost ubiquitous in FPS games today, but in service of taking a deep dive into how source engine movement works, let's start with the basics. There are two components to how your acceleration is determined, your directional input and your view angle. Since the y-axis is reserved for gravity, and what direction you move also doesn't rely on your vertical view angle, you can think of all of this in just two dimensions by viewing your character from a top-down perspective. With the standard WASD control scheme, W moves you forward with respect to your view angle, S moves you back, and A and D move you left and right. If you have full analog input, you get access to full 360-degree directional input, as well as full control over the magnitude of your acceleration, but for simplicity, we'll stick to the simple 8 directions. The source engine's grounded movement can be boiled down to this in nearly all circumstances, but what's really important to the depth of movement in these games is how movement in the air is handled. The rate at which you accelerate in the air is nearly meaningless, as there's an airspeed limit that prevents you from gaining any meaningful speed in the air. This limit is set very low, in TF2 at 30 units per second, where the max ground speed of the soldier is 240 units per second. This is not a problem in most situations, since this cap doesn't immediately take effect once you leave the ground, and it's only there to prevent you from gaining more if you're past that limit. If you jump off the ground moving at 240 units per second, and then input the direction opposite your current velocity, you'll quickly be put back to that 30 unit per second limit, moving in the opposite direction. But the source engine also has one last quirk for how that speed is limited, and to get into that, we need to get into some vector math. A vector, put simply, is a line made up of 2 points that has a direction. There are 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional vectors, but for this purpose we'll only need 2 dimensions to represent a bird's eye view of a first-person character. In Source, every player character has a velocity vector and an acceleration vector, where the velocity vector is the character's current velocity, and the acceleration vector is what will be added onto the velocity vector on that frame, as determined by the player's directional input and view angle as previously laid out. Adding 2 vectors together is visualized as putting one vector's head onto the other's tail, and drawing the resulting vector from the tail of the first to the head of the second, which is how acceleration is applied in the source engine. However, that engine quirk comes in with how the speed limit is checked. For whatever reason, Source doesn't straightforwardly limit your velocity vector every frame. Instead, it checks the projection of the velocity vector onto the acceleration vector against the airspeed limit. Vector projection is the result of drawing a line starting from the head of the first vector that is perpendicular to the second vector when both vectors share a tail. You can think of this as drawing a right triangle, where the velocity vector is the hypotenuse. If that point projected onto the acceleration vector is past the speed limit, no acceleration will be applied. But if you hold left or right perpendicular to your current velocity in midair, that acceleration vector will be applied because the projection of the velocity vector onto the acceleration vector is 0. You'll also gain a slight amount of speed because the new velocity vector resulting from adding the acceleration vector is also like a right triangle, where the new velocity is the hypotenuse and the old velocity is one of the other sides. If you remember your right triangle geometry, the hypotenuse is always longer than both the other sides of a right triangle, resulting in a higher speed. On the next frame, assuming there's no change in input, the projection will exceed the speed cap, so you won't gain any more speed. But if you turn your mouse such that your acceleration vector is once again perpendicular to your velocity vector, you will gain speed once again. This can be repeated for every frame after this, which allows you to gain theoretically infinite speed in the air, as well as providing robust maneuverability in the air that can't be achieved through any other means, which is a technique known as air strafing, the bedrock of all source movement game modes. But is it even necessary to replicate air strafing for this game at all? In beginning work on this project, I actually wanted to avoid using it if at all possible, because air strafing is notorious for being a counterintuitive mechanic that trips up new players, and not including it would undoubtedly make the game more accessible to players who may have no idea what rocket jumping even is. After all, practically every other FPS framework uses a much simpler method of calculating speed in the air that is basically the same as grounded movement, just with lower mid-air acceleration, which is far more intuitive for new players. But once I implemented a very primitive rocket jumping system, where I can create an invisible force instantly by clicking on a piece of collision, I realized that rocket jumping simply doesn't work without the specific calculations that the Source engine performs. This is because the vector projection that Source performs makes it such that you can only affect your midair speed in two ways: by holding the opposite direction of your current velocity, which will bring you to a quick stop midair, or by holding approximately perpendicular to your current velocity, which is the previously described air strafing. Under that simpler system, it's far too easy to lose speed in the air by moving in any direction other than straight forward, which to me is much worse than needing to tutorialize air strafing to new players. There may be other ways I could artificially introduce this mid-air control, but there are plenty of other upsides to using Source's movement, such as it being an already well-understood mechanic with plenty of documentation behind it. Additionally, once I fully implemented it into my engine, surfing on steep surfaces worked nearly identically to how it does in the Source engine, so I decided to settle for the downsides for this purpose. Another iconic mechanic of the Source engine's movement is bunny hopping, and thankfully it's quite simple compared to air strafing. When on the ground, your speed is not limited by a simple speed cap, it's rather limited by a friction value that limits your speed as you approach a soft speed cap that is determined by that friction value. But if you jump on the same frame that you hit the ground, this friction value will not be applied, and you'll retain whatever speed you had in the air. Combine this with air strafing, which allows for speed to be gained in the air, and you can build up theoretically infinite speed without needing infinite airtime to air strafe with. Bunny hopping, at least for the purpose of retaining speed, has been completely patched out of TF2, but as a mechanic that encourages faster and flashier movement, I thought it would be a great addition to the rocket jumping formula. But in keeping with my principle of consistency, bunny hopping can't remain a frame-perfect technique, as that's simply too precise to be consistent for most, if not all, players. The simple and obvious solution is to allow players to buffer their jump when they're in the air, or in simpler terms, allow a perfect bunny hop to be executed by pressing jump just before hitting the ground. This solution can be seen in the updated version of Quake on Steam, as well as in games like Devil Daggers and Hyper Demon, and it works great in those games, so I ripped that same method and put it in my game. You can't mash the button since there's a cooldown following the buffer, which keeps timing as an important skill in bunny hopping while making it feel more like an intended mechanic rather than a fortunate accident. The last thing to talk about for the time being is crouching, which is something I've removed from my design in favor of a mechanic that's a bit more kinetic. I don't like the way that crouching interacts with rocket jumping in TF2, because it's mostly just a button you almost always want to be holding in midair, while also adding unnecessary complexity due to mechanics like C-tapping. In all other instances, it actually makes you go slower, And while that's relevant to TF2 as a multiplayer game, it's irrelevant for the design of my game. So rather than crouching, I decided to implement a slide function. While sliding, you'll be locked going in the direction you started the slide in, and you'll also slowly lose speed during the slide down to a fixed value. This will mean that bunny hopping will still be the preferable movement option for maintaining and even gaining speed, but I anticipate the slide will have positive knock-on effects for the consistency of rocket jumping, as well as allowing for other interesting level design possibilities, like including tight spaces that you have to slide through. And with that, I've gone over all the work I've done so far. The next step in development will be to implement the rocket launcher and rocket jumping itself, and I already have some interesting ideas for how it will function at a low level that I'm interested to see manifest. That will likely be the next video I upload, so if you're interested in seeing that, consider subscribing to the channel to keep up to date on development. Until then, I hope this has been at least somewhat interesting, and possibly generate some interest in seeing a game like this made. It's something that I've thought about for a long time, and I'll do what I can to see it to some sort of release.